Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Inspired Piper. I'm Jock, and I'm going to try to do this all in one take because I do prefer doing it that way. I find it feels a little more natural. I want to talk in this episode about 5 books that have had a significant impact on my life. And I'm not talking about recent books, I'm talking about books that I've read when I was early. You'll see that some of them I started reading when I was a teenager and then a young man, and that have had a significant, like I said, a significant impact on my life. And some of these books, I only really understood the significance they had on me much later in life. But before I do, of course, because this is a pipe smoking channel, I want to talk about a bit of an event that pipe smokers experience sometimes on a regular basis that is part of the pleasure of pipe smoking, and that is the famous mail call, getting your delivery of pipes or tobacco blends. And so I had one this week, and where I got a couple of blends that I really like. Yeah, kind of. I'm gonna cellar these. In light of the impending and almost inevitable tobacco apocalypse that everybody's talking about. So what did I get? I got Solani 633 Flake, which somebody talked about on one of the forums, on one of the Facebook groups, and said, try this and you can thank me later. You're welcome. And he was absolutely right. I wish I remembered the gentleman's name, but yeah, Solani 633. Absolutely enjoy this blend. And the other one I stocked up on because I had ordered a tin a little while ago, and I posted it on a couple of the pipe smoking groups and said I was going to try it. But the St. Bruno Flake, which I indeed very much enjoyed. Shout out here to Mr. Dominic Allen from the UK, who said it would probably become one of my favorites. And I think that, yes, it's on its way to becoming one of my favorites. So thank you, Dominic, for pointing that out. I am enjoying it and have stocked up a little bit. All right, on to the books. So 5 books that have had a significant impact on my life. The first one I came across when I was about 13 years old. And I was just curious about it because I'd seen it in a couple of places. It was very popular at the time, so this would have been probably mid-70s, early to mid-70s. Yes, I'm dating myself here. And so I said, okay, well, let me read it and see what this is about. It looked a little weird, but I really enjoyed it, and it has been a constant companion of mine throughout my life. And that is Richard Bach's Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Now, this is, for those of you who have never read it, it is about a seagull. This is a story about a seagull who realizes that, a seagull doesn't just have to fight for scraps of food, and that's not what flight is about. That flying is this divine gift that seagulls have. And so he's always interested in flying higher and faster and learning acrobatics. And at some point, crashes into a cliff face and dies and goes to the great beyond, and where he meets a whole bunch of other birds who think very much like him. And he's always trying to go faster and higher than everybody else. And one of his elders, this is the key passage to me in the book, he says, "You will begin to touch heaven, Jonathan, in the moment that you touch perfect speed. And that isn't flying 1,000 miles an hour or 1,000,000 or flying at the speed of light, because any number is a limit, and perfection doesn't have limits. Perfect speed, my son, is being there." 13 years old when I read this, and I have reread this book. I lost count how many times I've read this, but this to me was the beginning of my journey towards mindfulness, which I'm very grateful to have today. But this, like, no matter what you do, being there is what's essential. And it's funny, just last night I was talking to someone who just recently visited Ireland and Scotland, and he talked about how he had bought this beautiful bottle of scotch in Scotland and brought it back home here in Canada, and was now going to keep it for a special occasion. And I said, well, what's the special occasion? What occasion is going to be special enough for you to crack open that bottle? Well, one day you'll realize that the special occasion is opening that bottle and having this beautiful scotch and enjoying it. So to me, that it all started here with Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Perfect speed, my son, is being there. Powerful stuff. Now, the second one, I kind of went on from Jonathan Livingston Seagull and came across another one of Richard Bach. Now, keep in mind, I'm 13, 14 years old at the time, and I came across Illusions, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah, about this Messiah who shows up and starts barnstorming with Richard Bach, flying vintage aircraft through the American Midwest and offering rides. And he's a Messiah. He understands the truth of the universe and doesn't like to announce that because he understands how people get into this mass hysteria kind of following, and he doesn't want to do that. But Richard Bach comes across a book in the Messiah's Paxac called The Messiah's Handbook, and it's full of beautiful little quotes here. For example, there's no such thing as a problem without a gift for you in its hands. You seek problems because you need their gifts. Indeed. Another one of my favorites that I've always loved. Argue for your limitations, and sure enough, they're yours. Love that. This too, we are responsible for our life. So this says, the world is your exercise book, the pages on which you do your sums. It's not reality, although you can express reality there if you wish. You're also free to write nonsense or lies or to tear the pages. And one last example I want to give you, because I've always loved this one as well. Here's a test to find whether your mission on earth is finished. If you're alive, it isn't. So very powerful book, very beautiful, poetic, great little story. And again, this what I got out of this was this sense of, yeah, you're alive. So your mission here isn't finished. Like there's always something. Onwards. Not long after that, I came across an author, and I think older folks will remember that if they were into that stuff at the time, a gentleman named Carlos Castaneda, who, the story goes, was an anthropology student at the University of California, and went down to Mexico to meet a Mexican shaman to learn more about hallucinogenic drugs and the way that the native Mexicans use that in their rituals. And so the first two books, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge and A Separate Reality, were about this 10-year apprenticeship that he did with this Mexican shaman about the use of hallucinogenic drugs, so peyote, for example. But then he kind of comes back and he says, you know what, over the past 10 years, Don Juan, the shaman, that he calls him like that, he remained anonymous, was teaching him some other stuff. And then he only realized later that the whole use of hallucinogenic drugs was mostly a tool to help Carlos get out of this, this ordinary reality that we all live in, and to understand some wider concepts. And so the third book was A Journey to Islam. Now this book looks weathered and beaten. Well, that's because it's about 30 years old, and I've read this one quite a few times as well. Now, one of the key lessons I got out of this one is there's a chapter called Death is an Advisor. Now, keep in mind, I'm about 15, 16 years old when I'm reading this. At 15, 16 years old, you're not thinking about death. And he replied that the issue of our death was never pressed far enough. And I argued that it would be meaningless for me to dwell upon my death, since such a thought would only bring discomfort and fear. You're full of crap, he explained. Death is the only wise advisor that we have. Whenever you feel, as you always do, that everything is going wrong and you're about to be annihilated, turn to your death and ask if that is so. Your death will tell you that you're wrong, that nothing really matters outside its touch. Your death will tell you, I haven't touched you yet. And so that was quite the passage. And he keeps on going here a little bit. He goes, yes, he said softly after a long pause. One of us here has to change and fast. One of us here has to learn again that death is the hunter and that it is always to one's left. One of us here has to ask death's advice and drop the cursed pettiness that belongs to men that live their lives as if death will never tap them. 15 years old, I'm reading this stuff and I'm starting to think about it, and I'm going like, wow, like at 15 years old, you don't start thinking about your death, right? You're invincible at this point. But that has remained with me throughout my life. And recently, and I've had friends die, grandparents, like all of us. Actually, this whole thing about books was kind of inspired by my late father here. When I was a young boy, he would read a lot. He passed away last year, and he was an avid reader, and he read a lot of books, and it inspired me to to see him read. And so I started very young, this whole reading adventure. But to think of death throughout life at such a young age is very powerful. Recently, I've been studying the Stoics. I started with Epictetus, and the Stoics are very much aware of death and do use death as an advisor. It was like 2,000 years ago. They were already aware of the power of using death as an advisor. Now, some people find the thought of thinking about your death a little macabre. I don't agree with that. To me, well, I don't agree. It's not for me, anyways. In my mind, realizing that we're all going to die and being conscious of it is an amazing motivator to live your life every day. I mean, I so love the Stoic philosophy, and I'm so enjoying reading that I've actually had it tattooed on my left forearm here, memento mori, remember you will die. So that had a huge impact because you just realize the value of life. And when something tragic happens and somebody goes, "Oh, you never know," I'm always like, well, yes, you do know. We're all going to die. It's just a question of when. So live your life while you're alive. So that eventually led me to another book that I'd heard about that was also very powerful. And that is, of course, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. For those of you who have never read it, Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who was imprisoned in the Nazi concentration camps. I can't remember which ones he was in. Anyways, but the first part of the book talks about his experiences in the camps. It is some of the most horrific things I've ever read, and he describes the situation incredibly well. And then the second book is about the psychology of logotherapy and how he, after being freed from the camps and surviving all that, he went on to keep practicing. But the key passage in this book is this uniqueness and singleness which distinguishes each individual and gives a meaning to his existence has a bearing on creative work as much as it does on human love. When the impossibility of replacing a person is realized, it allows the responsibility which a man has for his existence and its continuance to appear in all its magnitude. A man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears toward a human being who affectionately waits for him, or to an unfinished work, will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence and will be able to bear almost any how. So yes, there's always something to live for. If this guy can live through the Nazi concentration camps, I can't think of anything in this world today that, I mean, I know there's some areas that are dealing with conflict and war and stuff, but in our Western civilized world, we're so comfortable and we have everything we need. There's no reason for not having a why or a how. So that's 4 books. The 5th book, actually looking for it in my library, and I don't have it. And I'm guessing I lent it or probably even gave it to somebody. And it wouldn't be the first time I do so. I've probably already bought 3-4 copies of this book. And in my opinion, this is one of those books that every high school student should read when in high school before leaving and moving on to college or university. But that is Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That, again, some wonderful lessons in there. You know, this whole idea, he explains paradigms and paradigm shifts, and that kind of got me thinking very early on that we don't know everybody else's story, and what we think may be annoying, well, they're dealing with something, and when we understand that, we have this paradigm shift, we understand the other side of the story. Rule number 1, or habit number 1, was be proactive, and basically he says we are not our parents or our grandparents or our education or our culture or our country. We have the choice to be who we want to be. And so we can throw that all aside. And he says, things happen in life and we react. We're very emotional creatures. So things happen, we react. But he actually says there's a gap there. When things happen, we have that gap to choose our reaction. Again, now that I'm reading the Stoics, this is like 2,000-year-old stuff. That's exactly what Epictetus says. Things happen, we have a choice of how to react. And what I found amazing in my life is the more I became aware of this gap, the wider that gap got. right? So things happen, and then you can kind of go, okay, well, this happened. What now? What do I do? How do I react? Do I get angry and throw things at the wall, or punch something, or do I just, okay, accept what happened, and how do I correct it and move on? And what happens is when you practice this, that gap gets wider and wider, and it's all tied together. Mindfulness, right? Perfect speed is being there. Well, minding that gap comes with practice and mindfulness. And so that's had a tremendous effect on me of realizing, because shit happens in all of our lives, right? Difficult things. It's not all unicorns and rainbows. And so stuff happens, and some tragic stuff. And we have to learn to live with that and deal with that. So, started that very early, took a lot of practice. I'm going on 54 years old now, and I still won't say I'm a master of it, but it certainly has made a difference in the way I react to things and deal with things that come up. So those are the 5 books that had an impact on me very early on in my life that I'm grateful that I read many years ago. I was just having coffee with a local columnist here in town yesterday, and we were talking about philosophy and all that, and he says, yeah, 3 of those are right up on my list, and they were, Man's Search for Meaning, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and 7 Habits. So he agreed with me that those were very impactful books on him as well. So yeah, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is, well, it's fun, and 2, one of the things I notice about pipe smokers is they're typically very intellectual individuals as well, and there's something about the pipe that seems to evoke that. And so I'm very curious to find out what you guys have read and are reading. I see a lot of posts on some of the Facebook group where people are reading history, and that's amazing. I love history, philosophy, so I love that the fact that people are very intellectual that way and love to read. The problem with books and reading and knowledge is that there are just too damn many of them. There's so much stuff I'd love to read and learn about. I keep telling my wife I'm going to have to live till I'm 500-600 years old if I can tackle a fraction of what I'd like to learn. But that's also the joy of living, isn't it? I mean, finding out what resonates with you and what interests you and pursuing these and looking at them. So a 6-book little bonus book, and an absolutely shameless plug here, but a few people poked me on social media and said, hey, you should talk about your book again. So yeah, I did put together a book last year called Portrait of a Gentleman, Pipe Smokers from Around the World, where I have a bit of an introduction about my thoughts around pipe smoking and tobacco blends. And then what I did is I asked a bunch of pipe smokers from around the world to send me their picture and answer some questions about them. And of course, the first one alphabetically, of course, is Mr. Dominic Allen from the UK. So Dominic, it looks like this episode's dedicated to you, buddy. So it's fun because I got pipe smokers from all over the world talking about why they enjoy the pipe and all that. And I did a couple of interviews that are in there as well. A young man from Denmark, another one from Thailand. So yes, I'll put the link below. It's a nice book, 8x10 coffee table type book, and it's published. I put it up on Blurb. I don't have a publisher who could print a bunch of like hundreds or thousands of copies and make it inexpensive. So because it's print on demand, it's a little more expensive than I hoped it would be. But the people who've ordered it have enjoyed it, and so I'll put the link if you want to take a look and order it. Not that I'm making a ton of money off of this anyways. It was just fun to put together and to see people from all over the world. So yeah, that's it. 5 books that impacted my life. Would love to hear, from in the comments below. Let me know what has impacted you, what kind of books you love to read. I'm always up for learning about new authors or new books or new philosophies. It's just never ending. So until next time, have a very thoughtful and peaceful smoke, my friends.